Warning, emotions were involved in the making of this video, and also a woman made the video. Proceed with caution. Happiness, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, disgust. Those are the 6 primary emotions identified by Paul Ekman, a renowned American psychologist who was known for pioneering work in the study of emotions and their relationship to facial expressions. Then we have another list: joy, trust, fear, surprise, sadness, disgust, anger, anticipation. That is an expanded list of emotions, and it is based on Robert Plutchik's work, also a prominent psychologist known in the field of emotions. I know, it's a field. I bet we have all felt these emotions. The question is, do women feel them more than men? Do they feel them more richly, more often? Or are they simply more willing to express them? I have seen men on the internet say that they do not feel comfortable expressing sadness or fear in front of a woman. Now, I will not get into why that may or may not be, but not feeling comfortable expressing an emotion in front of someone does not equate not having an emotion. It more indicates an additional emotion: fear, stemming from distrust. We have all heard it. Men are more logical and women are more emotional. Now, this often comes with the very subtle implication that logic is better. That logic and emotion are separate. That emotion is nothing but a byproduct of our environment and our thoughts. That logic and emotion are divorced from each other. And that emotion should not be part of a decision because it simply clouds our judgment. I've heard it before, and I bet you have heard it before, that women often rely more on emotion than logical reasoning. But is that true? I have even heard some express that women should not vote because our emotions change week to week because of our hormonal fluctuations, and therefore we cannot be counted on to be making rational voting decisions. But I'll tell you this, I don't know a single woman whose vote fluctuates depending on where she is on her cycle. Oh yes, this week I'm a communist, but last week I was a free market capitalist because emotions. It might just be the case that we have different priorities, and that one side of the political spectrum, be it honestly or dishonestly, has found a way to appeal to more women's priorities. Now, you might think their priorities are all wrong, but they also think that of you. My personal opinion on voting: Plato was right. Most people should not be voting, no matter what your internal organs or external organs are. So I will argue 2 things on this video. One, that men being more logical is nothing more than a stereotype, and that research does not support this. And 2, that emotions are no lesser than logic, and they're just as important in the decision-making process, not to mention the human experience. In the past, I'm gonna admit, I thought this might be true because I heard it so much. Once you hear something so much, it becomes the truth, doesn't it? But then, upon further consideration, I have changed my mind on this. Violent crime is most often committed by men, and violent crime is not exactly a sign of logical reasoning, but of uncontrolled anger. I mentioned this on my video of the unhinged males, about these guys that went on a killing spree because they could not get a woman or they could not get a girlfriend. Yes, not exactly logical reasoning there. Suicide is also a lot higher in men. And again, suicide is not a logical decision. I sympathize with these men, but it is not a logical decision. Many of the men who take their own lives have families, and they feel like they do not have a place to vent their own emotions. They're not doing it because there's too many people in the world and they want to stop their carbon footprint. And who has not seen a man in their life, be it a husband, a dad, a brother, a boyfriend, lose their cool completely at an inanimate object? Or perhaps yell at the TV because their team is losing? What do you think yelling at the TV will accomplish exactly? Do you think the coach will hear you, or the printer will start working now? No. We all talk about the Karens, but let me tell you, as someone that worked in customer service, I often had more men yelling at me for things that I could not control than women. We all have emotions, and yes, men and women are different. I'm not denying that. But rather than a lack of emotion or less emotion in the case of psychopaths, do you want to be more like a psychopath? Men just express their emotions differently than women. Not to mention, what makes us emotional and men emotional is different. So, are there brain differences between men and women? Research says yes. And also no. This is a very controversial topic about brain differences, about the male and female brain, so I cannot find a clear-cut answer. It might be the case, as some argue, that the brain is not necessarily different, but that nurture and society makes our behavior different, which I personally don't buy. The other idea is that our brains are not necessarily different, but our hormones make us different. And that makes more sense to me and has some basis. In an article published by the Stanford Medicine named Two Minds, the author does concede that there are differences between how male and female brains are wired. He writes, quote, "Women excel in several measures of verbal ability, pretty much all of them, except for verbal analogies. Women's reading comprehension and writing ability consistently exceed that of men. On average, they outperform men in tests of fine motor coordination and perceptual speed. They're more adept at retrieving information from long-term memory. Men, on average, can more easily juggle items in working memory. They have superior visual spatial skills. They're better at visualizing what happens when a complicated 2 or 3-dimensional shape is rotated in space, at correctly determining angles from the horizontal, at tracking movement objects, and at aiming projectiles." Now, does this translate to logic? Not really. And I have to say, I agree. Sometimes my husband catches an animal in the distance, and I fail to see it for a while. But anyways, he goes on. Navigation studies in both humans and rats show that females of both species tend to rely on landmarks, while males more typically rely on, quote, dead reckoning, calculating one's position by estimating the direction and distance traveled, rather than using landmarks. Now, I fully believe this. I definitely use landmarks to place myself. The article says that the differences can be seen from infancy in that women are more oriented to faces, while men are to things, which might explain why women prefer working with people and men with things. Now, are faces more illogical than things? Maybe you think so. When it comes to brain differences, he writes, adjusted for total brain size, a woman's hippocampus, critical to learning and memorization, is larger than a man's and works differently. Conversely, a man's amygdala, associated with the experiencing of emotions and the recollection of such experiences, is bigger than a woman's. He does state in this article that women on average retain stronger, more vivid memories of emotional events than men do. In a 2014 study, University of Pennsylvania researchers found that female brains consistently showed more strongly correlated activity between hemispheres, while males' brain activity was more tightly coordinated within local brain regions. Brain differences can translate to behavioral differences, no doubt, but do they translate to the ability to think rationally? Being able to recall emotions more vividly and easily, that does not mean that impairs our ability to make logical decisions. And emotions are in fact crucial to decision making, but more on that later. That being something that does not mean that women are more illogical, also like men's amygdala is larger than women's, does not necessarily mean that they're more emotional either. So brain differences aside, are women more emotional? That is the question. That is the question. There's a long history why people think this. The word hysteria, for example, comes from the Greek word hystera, which means uterus. I hope I pronounced that correctly. The idea was that because of the uterus, women are more emotional, and unstable and more likely to develop behavioral issues, but not men because they do not have a uterus. I do wonder how they reached that conclusion that it was the uterus. In fact, hysterical women are often treated with hysterectomies. Yes, because that makes sense. Through the 20th century, this myth persisted. And despite current research, it still persists. And in the past, women were often excluded from research because of hormonal fluctuations. And scientists believe that because of hormonal fluctuations, you cannot possibly make reasonable predictions. A study published by Scientific Reports, which I will link below, found that essentially men are just as emotional as women. The study concluded, quote, inferential methods generally found evidence for group similarities to be roughly 3 times greater than evidence for differences. Okay, I'm going to read that again. Inferential methods generally found evidence for group similarities to be roughly 3 times greater than evidence for differences, and indicated that effect sizes, even if differences do exist, are likely to be very small. Thus, daily emotion fluctuates to similar extents in men and women. There may be sex differences in the factors that influence emotions, such as ovarian hormones, but those factors do not ultimately produce different outcomes with respect to affective variability. Now, some manosphere people, funnily enough, disagree with the idea that women are more emotional creatures without them knowing that they disagree with it, because they often describe women as cold and calculating beings with an inability to love like men can. And that kind of flies in the face of the idea that women are more emotional. But I don't agree with that idea, and I suspect most people don't either. Another study actually found that not only men are just as emotional as women, but they may, hear this word, may, even be more emotional during a breakup. The article by Forbes, which discusses this study, says, quote, in the analysis of 184,000 people who posted about their relationships to an anonymous online forum, researchers found that men discussed their feelings of heartbreak or sadness significantly more than the women did. This is interesting because of the idea portrayed online that women are out there venting on social media more often than men. But it might be the case that men vent more online, but they do so in forums rather than the more popular and visual methods like TikTok. That's just my own personal speculation, no research behind that. Not to mention, women are probably often just venting to their friends and family. Now, as I said earlier, I'm going to make the case for emotions. Yes, indeed. Because I think oftentimes we give logic a higher status in society, despite the fact that our society would not function without a marriage between the two. But most people don't think that. Most people think of emotion as weak, except for anger, of course, which might explain why men feel more comfortable expressing anger. And so they bottle up everything else inside them, and then they get stressed out and die early. I'm only exaggerating, kind of. I mean, there is some evidence suggesting that bottling up things in the body can lead to stress and can result in chronic illness and an early death. But regardless, I'm getting off track here. Neuroscientists have long known that emotion is what drives intelligent thought. In a 2007 article titled, quote, "We feel, therefore we learn," discussed how after studying patients who had suffered brain damage that affected their emotion but maintained their cognitive ability perfectly, were simply unable to make decisions on their daily lives. The neuroscientists claimed that emotions guide not only our motivation to learn, but our moment-to-moment problem solving and decision making. They argued that emotions are like the shelves that give cognitive glassware support. In the book, Descartes' Error, Emotion, Reason, and the Human Brain, Antonio Damasio challenges the traditional dichotomy between emotion and reason. He argues that emotions are not just a byproduct of thought, but a critical component of the decision-making process. In the book, he presents evidence that patients with damage to the prefrontal cortex, struggle with decision making despite having intact logical abilities. He shows that these patients can articulate logical solutions but then fail to act in real life situations due to their stunted emotional abilities. And despite that there's research that emotions are not simply a byproduct of circumstance or thought, most people are still clinging to the past, to old myths. I'm not exempt from this, but I suppose I would be motivated to look into the reality of this because, one, it kind of flies in the face of my day-to-day experience with people, both men and women. And two, the stereotype does not confirm my preferred bias, that emotions are lesser, that women are the emotional creatures and that men are the logical ones. And therefore, since it does not confirm my own bias, I'm more willing to stop believing it. There are plenty of things I had a way harder time to look into because I knew if I found out something that contradicted my beliefs, I might have had a hard time with it. It would be uncomfortable, but this is not one of them, I have to say. And guess what? Emotion was involved in the making of this video. Yes, indeed. I was not purely a logical creature when exploring this and researching this and making the video, because I would not have been able to do anything at all if emotion had not played a role, as you know, if you paid any attention. Thank you so much for listening, guys, and I hope me saying that emotions are part of the human experience and that both men and women experience it didn't trigger something negative in you, but if it did, consider why. I'll leave you guys all the research links and mentioned sources in the description. And see you next time. Subscribe.